Okay, I have 12:30, so let's go ahead and begin. Welcome to the Chesapeake Watershed Forum's 12:30 webinar session, Heat, Health, and Trees. My name is Craig Highfield. I'm with the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. I'll be facilitating today, and providing technical support is Lucy Heller, also with the Alliance for the Chesapeake. Good advance. You've probably seen this many times in these sessions, but this session will be recorded and shared at a later time. Attendees are muted by the host. Please add your questions for the presenters in the chat box throughout the session. And then if you're having any technical issues, please message the host in the chat box. Well, today we have a great group of presenters. We have Dr. Jeremy Hoffman. He's Chief Scientist from the Science Museum of Virginia. Melissa Deas, a Climate Program Analyst with the DC Department of Energy and the Environment. And Bryant Smith, Executive Director of Baltimore Tree Trust. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Hoffman.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And first of all, I want to thank the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay for allowing us to have this session all about trees and health and equity. And I'm so thrilled to be sharing space on this panel with my co-presenters, Melissa and Bryant. It's just like a thrill to be able to share with you all the science and the policy and the boots on the ground kind of stuff. So at first I'm going to share my screen. We're actually going to get started by doing an exercise all about what the fundamental physics of this entire session is all about. So if you would go to the link that is now in the chat and click in. We're going to do a little quiz to get us started. So follow this link to Mentimeter or follow the directions on the screen to use your smartphone. And go ahead and follow that link and try and make a hypothesis about which of these surfaces in this picture, which is a picture out of my my office at the Science Museum of Virginia here in Richmond, which of these surfaces is going to be the hottest on a sunny summer day. And let me make sure I got my stopwatch going. Let's see what the results are kind of showing. We can switch back over here. Okay, we've got 14 people all in agreement. Asphalt parking lot. Maybe I, be a little bit easy kind of question. It seems like no one's fallen for it. So why don't we move on to the next question, which is actually the opposite. Which of these surfaces would, instead of being the hottest, which one is going to be the coolest on a sunny summer day? Well, I'm not fooling anybody at the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. We're seeing several answers come in, looking at the big tree, a few answers from the native plant garden. And within my talk, we'll actually get into the answer of this question. So I'm going to leave you a little tantalized to find out what the real solution is to this question. I'm glad to see there's a little bit of distribution around this answer about which is the coolest surface in this picture. So keep voting, but actually I'm going to switch back my screen now to go back to the slides and start to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing. Please, next slide. As you know, actually you can go on next slide as well. These 4 bar plots basically are showing that heat waves are already longer, stronger, more frequent, and are happening at weirder times of the year than before. And this is a clear signal of climate change, primarily caused by human emissions of heat-trapping gases. Please, next slide. And why does that matter? Well, heat is really important to our public health. So more people die every single year due to extreme heat waves than any other weather-related hazard that we encounter here in the United States, including even the big ones that you hear about on the news, like hurricanes and tornadoes. So please, next slide. We learned about this probably the most significantly in the Chicago heat wave of 1995, which disproportionately resulted in mortality in poorer, marginalized, elderly, Black communities And actually at the same time, my family, I was growing up on the northwestern suburbs of Chicago at this time, and we were having a yard party and enjoying a slip and slide. And just a few miles away, people were suffering significant mortality. So this has a direct connection to my own life and my own privilege to be able to not suffer from heat-related illnesses during these significant events. So please, next slide. And so most of the time when we look at the response of public health over temperature, which we're looking here on the bottom, is temperature along the bottom getting hotter to the right. Up on this graph is a relative percentage of the number of people that are reporting to urgent care centers and hospitals for heat-related illnesses. Next slide, please. Many cities and places around the country, this is specific to Virginia, have this kind of response, where instead of it being, you know, a linear thing where for every incremental increase in temperature, we see an incremental increase in the number of people suffering heat-related illnesses, it actually is an accelerating graph, meaning that as it gets hotter, more and more people are getting sick. And in fact, in 2019, over 1,000 people in Virginia sought emergency care for heat-related illnesses. Next slide, please. We know that heat doesn't express itself evenly everywhere. And, you know, I asked you that question before. Next slide. The coolest place in this photo is actually the shady spot under the big oak tree. Second place is under those other smaller trees. And then the native plants actually are relatively cooler than the grasses. And then the warmest things are the built surfaces like the asphalt and the sidewalk. Those dried grass can actually be as warm as the sidewalk. And so when we zoom out of this kind of picture, which shows us the temperature variation across, or the surface temperature variation across a landscape, next slide, please. We see this from space as urban heat islands. And traditionally, this is defined as the difference between the rural outlying areas and the interior of an urban environment. But there are many different types of ways to define the intensity of an urban heat island. Please, next slide. One of my colleagues, Vivek Chandas, who I've had the really distinct honor of being able to work on in several cities in the Chesapeake Bay region, determined the methodology for assessing air temperature variation across urban environments using these kind of low-cost sensors that hang out of car windows. And next slide, please. We actually did this in Richmond back in 2017 in collaboration with the RVA Green 2050 crew at the City of Richmond Sustainability Office. Next slide, please. As well as the nonprofit Groundwork RVA, which is part of the Groundwork USA network. Please look them up. They do amazing work called this Climate Safe Neighborhoods program. And Groundwork RVA has been a substantial partner over the years for the Science Museum of Virginia's ongoing work on environmental stressors and the disproportionate impact on neighborhoods in the city of Richmond. So please, next slide. We went out on during a heat wave. We wanted to measure kind of that largest difference between the coolest and warmest places based on those built environment aspects, and really get to the greenest, shadiest areas and the kind of most paved out, low slung buildings kind of areas. And this is Ajana James, who was a sophomore at the time, attaching that sensor. This appeared in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. So we got a lot of attention around our campaign. Please, next picture or next slide. We found a 16-degree Fahrenheit difference between the coolest and warmest place at the exact same time on the same day. It turns out that this is the same pattern that we identified in the city of Washington, D.C. and the city of Baltimore. Two people, Melissa and Bryant, who will talk about a little bit about that, I'm sure, in their presentations. We actually went and did the same campaign there in 2018, finding a similar magnitude difference between the coolest and warmest places. Now, when we look at the relationship between this and our public health data, next slide, please, we see that actually, remember those heat-related illness data was in a line. Doesn't tell us anything about space. When we look at where we go to respond to heat-related illnesses the most, we see this is a graph from the Richmond Ambulance Authority showing that most of our ambulance responses are in the hottest parts of our city. These also disproportionately impact Black residents. 60% of these ambulance responses are for Black individuals, but they only make up about 48% of our population. Next slide, please. What adds another layer to this, of course, is COVID-19. Developing a COVID or a heat vulnerability map, which is on the left with my colleagues at RVA Green 2050. We also then developed a COVID-19 risk map using variables related to both jobs, housing, and health. And then in the heat vulnerability sense was actually exposure and adaptive capacity. And they look the same. So next slide, please. What's really the way that we can kind of look at this through a historical lens? Because in many cities across the country, we're seeing these exact same patterns of heat, health, COVID-19, everything seems to overlap in the same neighborhoods. Well, there's this policy from the 1930s and 1940s called redlining, which basically restricted housing infrastructure and investment from entering into particular neighborhoods based on the race and immigrant status of the population that was living there. And here in Richmond, please, next slide, we've been able to look at what this looks like at the individual level. This is one particular redline neighborhood, CARVER and Jackson Ward, that was referred to as just having 95% Negro inhabitants. Next slide, please. Just across town, a few miles away, they were referred to as the best people. This neighborhood remains largely white and wealthy, with a much larger or longer life expectancy than the folks that live just on the other side of town. So what does this look like when we look at the environment? Next slide, please. These maps appeared in the New York Times article that I referenced earlier, where we show that the redlined areas are more paved. Next slide. They have fewer trees. Next slide. And they are warmer than their neighbors. So when we zoom out to the whole country, next slide, please, we had this paper published in January where we looked at every redlining map in the country and assessed their temperature differences between each grade that was assigned by the redlining policy. Next slide, please. We identified a 4.5 or 5 degree difference between the formerly redlined and non-redlined areas. Kind of observing this difference in exposure, and this is directly related to the underlying land use. So please, next slide. We see that these areas tend to have much more dark, hard surfaces. Next slide, please, and substantially fewer trees. Now, this is different depending on what area of the country you're in, but these results have been replicated in a few different places now, suggesting that this is a real phenomena of disproportionate exposure to extreme heat. Next slide, please. It doesn't end there. Colleagues at the NCRC and the University of Richmond have recently identified that not only are these places formerly redlined areas hotter, but they also experience higher poverty, higher social vulnerability, poor mental health, lower life expectancy, more obesity. So what's 1% of one thing that we can do to start to ameliorate these differences? Please, next slide. Of course, as you know, trees are one of the main benefits. Now, there are other shorter term investments and things that we can do, which you'll hear about from my co-presenters. But of course, trees are one of the main benefits that can prepare long-term shifts away from these heat impacts. So thanks so much. Next slide. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Email me or find me on social media. And thanks to my co-presenters for being here today.
Well, excellent. Thanks, Dr. Hoffman. Looking in the chat, we don't have any questions in there. So if anyone has any questions, please type them in. One question, is there a link to Dr. Hoffman's paper? Is that something you can send out?
Yeah, let me do that right now. So this is the link.
Okay.
Back on. answer questions with my video on. Here's the link to the paper.
And while you're putting that link in, now the questions are rolling in here. Are any communities not open to planting trees?
Yeah, I'll definitely defer to my co-panelists, who I think will talk more about that. And that's something that I wish I could get into more deeply in my presentation. But yeah, there is a apprehension to trees in many neighborhoods. And so that shines a light directly on the fact that we need to be engaging across these municipalities, these neighborhoods, and really lifting up the voice and vision of the people that live there to determine what have their own power to decide what the land use changes are in the future. I just recommend trees as one of many.
Excellent, excellent point. Are there plans to repeat the monitoring efforts again in the same cities now that it's been a few years since the initial measurements?
That's a great question, and the only restriction is funding. These volunteer campaigns require investment in not only the data analysis and everything, but actually compensating our volunteers and coordinating the campaign. So certainly, if there has been enough of a change to the canopy or the reflectivity or the built environment in these cities that we feel like we could detect that, I would 100% be for doing it again. But we do see from even longer term citywide plans, like in the city of Chicago, which has done a substantial amount of change in their rooftop garden program, like green roof program, that really they're only able to detect subtle changes to their albedo, which is the reflectivity. So you would need some seriously substantial land use change in order for these things to really be ameliorated. However, we can go out after a tree has been planted and show you the surface temperature difference using a thermal camera like the one I have. So it depends on the scale of the question at hand.
Okay, great. Next question. How long would it take to receive the benefits from planting trees in redlined areas? That seems like something that people 30 to 40 years from now may benefit from.
If we think about trees as isolated in the sense of the only thing that is their benefit is the mature canopy, then yeah, I agree with you. It's 30 or 40 years for the full benefit of the huge air conditioner that they would become. However, I think that tree planting programs can be brought alongside placemaking programs, like making new parks. We've been successful in building 2 new parks here in the city of Richmond. Our mayor has announced 5 new green spaces to be made entirely on the south side of the city, which is mostly communities that have been marginalized. And so I think that we can consider tree planting to be one of many things that we can tie trees to beneficial places so people can actually kind of create more community cohesion, as well as understand that that can ameliorate some other things like stormwater management and air quality and noise pollution. So I think that there is a lot more than just the 30-year time horizon, as long as we start to connect some other things like placemaking and stormwater management.
Okay. Next question. Have you worked with NASA on this?
We worked with the NASA Develop group back in 2017 and 2018 to understand more about land use change in the city of Richmond over time and the evolution of the urban heat island, or the surface urban heat island. And I continue to work with NASA on several aspects of research in cities and colleagues that work with them. So yeah, we've worked with NASA quite a bit.
Okay. And then can you say a little bit more about how the heat mapping was done in Richmond?
Sure. Yeah. The heat mapping. So we went out in you saw the thermometer sticking out of the car. And so we dispatched about like 15 or 16 cars to drive out all into different places all at once at the same times during a heat wave event. So we coordinated like driving routes and places for folks to go. And that was part of the community engagement, actually. Folks were able to help us determine where to go in a particular sector of the city to kind of capture where people go to hang out, where the parks are, where the hottest spot might be, where the coolest spot might be. And so we really depend on that kind of community knowledge to inform the methodology. It's really a neat community science kind of model that has been replicated now up to 20 or 30 cities, I think, over the last few years. So it really depends on getting a core of folks together with cars, bikes, even people could use alternative forms of transportation like scooters or electric bikes, and really just getting a team together to map the heat during a heat wave.
Very good. Well, that wraps that up. Jeremy, you'll be on for the rest of the time, I'm assuming. So if any other questions do come up, but I'd like to turn it now over to Melissa Deas for her presentation.
Hi, I think we were first going to go to the Mentimeter.
Yeah, we'll
Sure.
go back to the Menti.
So while they're pulling that up, I can quickly introduce myself. My name is Melissa Deas, and I lead our climate resilience work for the District of Columbia. I sit within the DC Department of Energy and Environment. So my primary job is to implement our Climate Ready DC plan, which came out in 2016 and identifies a number of strategies to combat climate change risks. So Jeremy, are you going to be showing? Okay.
Yeah, I was just waiting for you to have
Perfect.
a break. Yeah.
Perfect. So we are asking a couple of open-ended questions here. So it's just going to create a word cloud. So if you type in something, that the question here is, where do most residents surveyed in the district spend their time on a hot day? We recently did a survey of district residents, and this was one of the questions we asked. So we'll tell you what the actual answer is in a second, but just curious All right, inside, at home, museums, office, park. I'm gonna give it a couple more seconds. Front porch.
That's fascinating.
Nearest pool. Yeah, all really good thoughts. Okay, so the actual it's a little bit less detailed than what you guys are giving me. I don't know where in their homes, but 88.68% of people reported that they're most likely to stay at home during an extreme heat day. So really the vast majority are going to stay home. And then we also asked, if you leave your home during an extreme heat day, where are you most likely to go? And the most popular answer at 20% was to a friend, family, or neighbor's house. So most people are either staying at home or going to somebody else's house. The other answers that were popular included other public air-conditioned space, pools or splash pads, followed a little bit at 12% by a park or other outdoor space. We also asked the question in terms of, given the COVID-19 pandemic, where are you most likely to go? And sorry, I'm seeing that answers are already coming in for my next question. I haven't even gotten there.
Yeah.
No worries. The last point I just wanted to make is that with the COVID-19 pandemic, we are actually still seeing that a lot of people, 31% said that they would go to a friend's house. And I'm hoping that that is in a pod and that they are just doing that responsibly. But then we also saw that the interest in using parks and outdoor spaces has gone up. And that now it's closer to 20% said that if they need to cool off somewhere outside of their home, they're going to use a park and are much less likely to go to another public air-conditioned space. So that I think talks a little bit about the increasing importance of parks. So going to the next question. What are some of the top challenges residents report for staying cool? And so we're seeing some answers. I'll give it a couple seconds for more answers to come in. All right. So no AC is turning out to be the top answer. And that's partially correct. The cost of electricity is actually higher. 26.7% said it's the cost of electricity, whereas only 9.5% said it's the cost of an AC system, or that, and we have another 4 or 5% that landlords don't allow for AC, so that there's sort of a number of different layers to this, so it's a little bit hard to parse out exactly, but costs in the district remain a huge challenge. And we've also learned from some engagement that we've recently been doing that there are real barriers, especially to people who rent. Sometimes landlords will charge more to have an AC unit in the building, so your summer bills can actually be higher than your winter bills, because we require that landlords keep units a certain temperature in the winter months, but we don't have any similar requirement for the summer months. So we're seeing some real concerns around that. And there's also some safety concerns that people have about window units that we're also hearing in some of those most sensitive neighborhoods. All right, so I am going to switch to my presentation. Thank you. All right, so I generally start my presentations on heat with this slide. I think this is speaking a little bit to a group of people who already know all of this, but when we talk about heat, I like to stress that it's comprehensive. People think about heat stroke, heat rash, heat exhaustion, all of those direct health risks, but heat has so many other implications. Our metro in the district has to run slower during heat events. Sometimes the trains can't run at all if it is a certain temperature, because those rail lines can buckle. It has impacts for our water quality. It can lead to power outages, and we always see a rise in crime during the hottest days of the year. Next slide. So the district also did one of those same heat maps that Jeremy was showing, same method. We were really, really lucky to be able to partner with Jeremy and Vivek and the rest of the team and found similar results in the district that we definitely do have an urban heat island. Next slide. And we've taken this map similarly to what they did in Richmond to identify where are the neighborhoods that are most at risk. And so our method in the district is we created a heat sensitivity index where we took a lot of those different factors that make somebody more sensitive to the impacts of heat. So older populations, people with pre-existing health conditions, low income people who might not have air conditioning or be able to afford to run their air conditioning, people of color. I think there's about 8 different things that go into that heat sensitivity index. And then we took the heat maps, which shows our hottest neighborhoods, layered in our tree canopy data, our impervious surface canopy data, and created this exposure index, and then combined them to identify some of the neighborhoods that are most at risk. And that's driving a lot of the work that we're doing right now as we're developing a comprehensive heat strategy for the district. Next slide. So those are some of those neighborhoods that we identified as most at risk. And for each of these, we're also going to be tracking our tree canopy over the years to come. So every year we do a progress report. And while our canopy data doesn't come out every year, we are going to be tracking plantings and removals in all of these neighborhoods. Next slide. So when we're doing our comprehensive heat planning, I sort of categorize the policies that we're thinking about into 2 buckets. So what are the policies to keep people safe, given that it is going to get hotter no matter what? We're going to have extreme heat days. How do we make sure that people stay safe? And then what are our policies to cool down the city, to actually reduce that urban heat island? So this, what I'm showing you, is some work that we did with Vivek again around that keeping cool side, where we actually modeled in 3 different blocks of the city. So this is really the micro scale in terms of thinking about interventions, what different interventions and what they would do in terms of mitigating heat. So what you're seeing here is an example of one of those communities where we knew that there's no planned redevelopment for this community. So we're like, we basically asked if we can't change anything about the buildings that are there, what can we do on the edges? So if we fill out every tree box that's in this community, what does that look like? If we add a water feature, what does that look like? And we modeled that out. Next slide. And then we looked at 2 other communities. So this is a public housing development that is under currently planned to go through a major renovation, basically. And we looked at 2 different basically design plans for this site. So we looked at one where they're going to build big high rises and one where there's sort of a mix of different type of building typologies. And then for those, we also looked at what happens if we add a bunch of trees. Underpinning some of these decisions, we're thinking, okay, so every building, no matter what, that goes into this has to meet our stormwater requirements, which means that it has to have a certain amount of green space. But you can choose how you're doing that green space. You can do green roofs to meet all of that. You can do trees to meet all of that. We know that we have to build a certain number of units. So using the real restrictions that are in the district to ask this question of, can we increase the housing density on this site and reduce the urban heat island at the same time? Next slide. And so what we found through this modeling effort is that trees, as Jeremy also found, were the big winners. They reduced the temperatures in these areas 5 to 12 degrees during the hottest time of the day. So that is really the lesson that carried in all 3 examples that we looked at. We did find that density and heat can coexist, that the 3rd site, which I didn't show, was just a vacant lot. That's a big grassy green field, and we added a building and successfully still brought down the temperature of that grassy field. So there are things that you can do. So we don't have to forego affordable housing to get to a reduced urban heat island. So that's a really important lesson. And then we also learned that some of the things that might be really good for a building in terms of having it be the most efficient building, like a cooler green roof, might not really matter for someone standing and waiting for a bus on the sidewalk. And that's where we really see trees being the winner. Now, all of this is modeled results. It definitely has limitations. The biggest limitation is we looked at a 24-hour period, so it's hard to account for sort of the sustained absorption of heat over many, many days that we see during a heat wave. And so we'd want to verify this with some ground truth results in the future. Next slide. So one of the things I should explain about the district is that we have a lot of different regulations that require greening every time we put a building into the ground. So basically, any new construction that happens in the district makes our city greener than it was before. But a lot of those incentives are driven by our combined sewer versus separate sewer. And we are incentivizing a lot of that work to happen in our separate sewer, so this light gray here. Unfortunately, our urban heat island is basically an inverse of that. So one of the challenges of using the tools that we have at our disposal, which are often through our clean water requirements, is that they're not incentivizing policies where they're needed most. So this is one of the challenges that I'm working on thinking through how we can start to overcome that. Next slide. So another way that we're thinking about cooling the city down is using resilient design guidelines that we've developed. So partially this is just to help people think through, how many cooling degree days do we need to start planning for in the future compared to what we've historically used. But it's also to identify policies that can get the right kinds of greening into buildings as we're putting those buildings in. Next slide. This is just a couple of examples of strategies that are in that resilient design guidelines. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I mostly just wanted to say that these are something that we are working on and are putting out soon. Next slide. But like I said, so far I've mostly been focusing on the keeping cool, but we also need to make sure people are safe, given that most residents are going to stay home. How do we meet them where they are? How do we make sure that they are served? So we've been doing a series of focus groups over the last couple of months where we've been trying to engage with people who have experienced homelessness, people who don't speak English, people who are low income and live in rental housing and public housing, and reach some of those populations that we know are most at risk, and really hearing what are the services that they are most interested in. And a lot of it just comes to education, that people need to know what are the cool ways to cool off my home, or the cheap ways to cool off my home using a fan. What are the resources that are available? We have cooling centers in the district, but we're learning that most people don't know that those exist. So I think one of the primary lessons is that just old school outreach through the mail is something that is really valuable, but that people are also really, really excited about trees in their neighborhood. We hear anecdotally that people don't like trees, but in every one of these sessions, trees were something that people really wanted to see, and they wanted a tree in their neighborhood, but they wanted that tree to be in a place that felt safe, that didn't have litter, that was well lit. And so making sure that we're creating places that are actually usable spaces in the communities where they're needed most. Next slide. So these are some of those other strategies that we're talking about. We're talking about how do we check on people on the hottest days, actually knock on their door, see if they're doing okay. How do we get information out? How do we make sure that cooling centers are places that people want to go to? There's a number of other policies that we're considering, but I just wanted to share those. And next slide. I'll wrap it up there, but happy to answer questions.
Okay, excellent. Folks, if you could put questions in the chat box if you have them. We do have a question here. Is there a publicly available tool for heat modeling? That would be a great asset for commenting on development proposals.
So our heat maps are available in the district. We are working on getting them, I think, a little bit more user-friendly in terms of available, but outside of the district, I do not think that such a thing exists. Jeremy, do you know of anything?
Yeah, so that's a really great question, Renee. That there are some tools like the one that I've posted here in the chat. It's a severity map, so it just determines the difference from kind of like the citywide average for tons of cities, 14,000 cities around the U.S. It doesn't tell you anything about specific temperature, to the like degrees, but it will show you at least a good starting point and a useful first step toward assessing the heat in your city.
Very good. Okay, any other questions? Great. Well, we're moving on pretty good here, so we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I like to
see one question that just came in.
Oh, look at that. Oh, how had the current administration impacted your department?
So always a tricky question to know how to answer. I think
Exactly.
one of the main challenges is that in the last 4 years, we've seen a lot less federal funding to support anything in the climate space. The FEMA, I would say, has been doing a lot of work trying to rethink their program so that it can support mitigation more, but those programs tend to support flood reduction a lot more than heat. So trying to find funding to do heat work has been really, really challenging because there aren't great sources. And it's such a new field that I think people are still trying to figure out what are the right things to invest in, which is why we've been doing so much work on the mapping and modeling side so that we can start really having a compelling case to make that we've done the research that can go into why we want to do these kinds of programs.
Okay. Can you say a little more about how you're doing climate heat planning going forward and any collaboration with urban forestry?
Yeah, so on the collaboration with our urban forestry, our urban forestry team has been using our heat maps already to identify places that could use more tree canopy. And so they are actively putting trees in there. And I think also thinking about tree variety in terms of what trees are going to provide the most shade benefit using our maps. So that's really exciting that is going forward. I would say one of the challenges in the district is that we actually are almost fully planted. So a lot of the work has to be getting trees on private property. And so working in some of these same communities to get them on private property is really the next step. And then in terms of our next steps, like I said, we did this survey, so we've got a lot of feedback. We've been doing focus groups to get even more feedback on what strategies people are most excited about. And so the next step is to take all of that information and to synthesize it and develop a plan that identifies specific policies that the district is going to pursue on both that keeping cool and keeping safe side, and then start to implement it. So hopefully sometime next summer, we'll be releasing that comprehensive heat strategy, and then it'll be about making it happen.
Good. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by ground truth validation?
Oh, no, that was me to somebody else, but sorry.
Oh.
No, go ahead though, Melissa. That's a good.
But I can't answer that. In terms of our modeled results, because it is modeled results, it would be, I think, stronger evidence if we are planting trees and actually showing the temperature differentials before and after those planted trees. If we're putting in green infrastructure and showing that. One of the tools that we have for getting greening into the city is called the green area ratio, which basically gives properties a different number of points for different green techniques that they're putting in. It would be good to have those green techniques points be partially determined by the heat island combating benefits of the different strategy. And so if we want to get that granular, we need to do some actual like heat monitor sensing techniques.
Okay, I see what was happening there. Great. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thanks, Melissa. I'd like to now turn it over to Bryant for the final presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be a part of the panel, and I look forward to talking to everyone about how trees and communities work together to address issues related to urban heat. Next slide. So this is a slide of Baltimore City. It shows the percent of impervious surface. And as you can see, the core of the city has a very high percent of impervious surface. And the residential areas in that high impervious surface sector, as we know, kind of store and remits high levels of heat in the summer. And unfortunately, the people in those areas are struggling with medical and other issues caused by those high levels of heat. Next slide. So some of the tools we use to address urban heat issues throughout Baltimore City is to remove as much impervious surface as we can and plant trees. There are several organizations that we work with, and all of us are working together to help Baltimore City reach its goal of 40% tree canopy. And this slide shows you our planting priority locations, which are tied to the high impervious surface areas. So our tree planting operations, provides that social and environmental impact to try to help counteract, the negative health conditions for residential folks who are in those sectors. Next slide, please. So as we continue to plant trees throughout the city and mitigate the effects of urban heat, we learn through this process that community engagement and connecting to the project is very, very important. And we cannot implement any type of heat reduction projects without community residents being a part of the planning process all the way down to breaking ground. We really need to have that community buy-in in order to have a successful project. So this slide is a slide of a picture of a project in East Baltimore, where we went in and we removed several hundred square feet of impervious surface, and to replace with trees to help address some of the issues that we've been mentioning earlier. But there was some resistance, that we have a lot of community residents, especially in areas where we're trying to do these projects, that are not supportive of the work that we are trying to do. And a lot of that is tied to just not enough awareness about the benefits of tree planting. And some of it is tied to fear, fear of damage to property, both the actual structure of the house or sewer lines, or uplifting the sidewalk. And so because of that fear and because of not really understanding the benefits of the trees we install, we do get some resistance and pushback. A lot of that fear and resistance also is tied to past projects, folks coming into neighborhoods, not really properly engaging community residents, getting their feedback, allowing them to be a part of the planning process. So we work really hard in order to successfully reduce those high heat levels, get more trees in the ground, to put a lot of energy into community outreach and engagement, really making sure that we are allowing community folks to be a part of the planning process and direct us once we get that awareness piece in place on where they want the trees, what green spaces where we should be opening, and really try to have our work be a part of this whole community model, where it's just not tree in the ground, where it's not just tree to help reduce high heat levels, but how do we use our work to tie into kind of this larger community development piece. Next slide. And so one of the ways of building that trust, keeping community folks engaged, is data sharing, really being transparent with the tools that we're using to try to identify areas to target, having that conversation and sharing that data with residents so that not just the organization is using data to make plans for reducing heat, but also having community folks access the same data. And the Baltimore City Department of Recreation and Parks Forestry Division put together a really cool tool, putting together a tree inventory that anyone can use that will provide us the data that you see in front of us, current available planting spaces, where trees are now. And that tool is allowing us to really do good work with addressing heat issues in urban areas, but then strengthening our partnerships with community residents while we're using kind of the same data to work on community-based issues. Next slide. And so in addition to the data, in addition to getting residents to the table and helping with planning, the building of the trust of allowing us to plant trees, allowing us to tackle those urban heat issues, we also tie that into creating careers and pathways for residents to participate in urban forestry work, right? And so that allows us to not only strengthen the number of urban forestry stewards that's going to be in the field, that's going to continue to help us address these heat-based issues, but we're also providing these specialized career pathways for residents who come in through our workforce development program. And so that's now providing us the tool for strengthening that awareness about the work that we're doing, building a better understanding of why we need to plant more trees in the city. It's again providing us the opportunity to strengthen the ranks of individuals who are out there trying to help us meet our tree canopy goals as well. So all of those pieces in the end builds a stronger connection to communities, which then allows us to really meet our mission and reducing these high heat levels and providing all of those great impacts because we put those trees in the ground. Next slide. So I want to end with that and thank you for allowing me to speak about the work that we're doing in the city as far as using trees to help reduce high heat levels. And then I will pass the floor back on to you.
Okay, again, if you folks have questions, please put it in the chat box. We do have one question here about, community members' comments about trees will impact sidewalks. What's an effective way to answer that or to come back to alleviate their concerns?
Yeah, so what we do now, a lot of it is installation specs over time. I think a lot of cities at one point were opening up street tree pits at a 4x4 square, but we've learned to open those pits up larger. So larger pits, being very mindful about the species that we put in place as well. The good thing about here in Baltimore City is that the forestry division is very helpful with working with the Department of Transportation so that if a tree did buckle the sidewalk, those two agencies in partnership with the individuals that put the trees in the ground will work together to correct the problem. So that's been a big help with really selling support for the work that we're trying to do as far as putting more trees in the ground, because now we do have those partnerships with city agencies that will help address any damage, which then strengthens communities' ability to trust us to plant more trees.
Very good. Next question. How are you getting your best funding? Is it through stormwater fees, through grants?
So it would be, for us, it would be through grants, although we are getting, so we are not getting stormwater fee funding directly. Our partner, Tree Baltimore, they are receiving stormwater funds who then support the work that we're doing by providing us with tree stock and other items and city service support that allow us to do our work. So that's from the mitigation side. It kind of comes through Tree Baltimore. But on the organization side, it's more for grants and contracts.
Okay. Man, these questions are coming in now here. The next question is, I am curious about the career pathway aspect of the tree planting effort in Baltimore. Can you discuss this aspect a bit more? Are these urban forestry positions permanent, or do they lead to other careers?
They do. And so it's interesting, you think about workforce development related to tree plantings in the past. What we found was that focusing on just placing individuals into landscaping positions and then hoping for the best was just not a good model for one, a career pathway, but actually having people we keep an interest in the urban forestry work. So through our workforce development program, we have created those career pathways where we could say, we work with that specific individual to figure out what their interests are, and then tie that interest to potential pathways in the urban forestry field. And what we're trying to do is keep people in this field. So we want to place them in positions that will provide that long-term career opportunity. And so not just looking at putting someone in a shovel to dirt operation, but they might be on a tech side that's supporting urban forestry. They might be on a heavy equipment side that's supporting urban forestry. But using this kind of diversity of opportunities in urban forestry as potential landing points for folks that come in through our workforce development program. So the key is long-term interest in supporting urban forestry work, finding positions that will allow folks who participate in our programs to do that.
That's excellent. Are you able to plant tree species that will produce shade more abundantly or quickly?
We do, and that is definitely supported through the impervious surface removal work. There are tons of locations to plant, but we got to get that concrete out of there, and we're able to do that through our partnership with Tree Baltimore.
Okay, great. Do community members help water their trees in Baltimore City? Is this tied in any water collection? Is this tied into any water collection in any way?
So what we want, it's interesting, I feel like in urban forestry that there was some shift, right, with the standard community forestry practices, in my opinion. We worked heavily with residents to support maintenance work for the trees. That shifted a little bit where more of the maintenance, it's on the side of the organization. But we are bringing back those standard community forestry practices and working in partnership with residents to water. So it helps us, we, instead of having the fleet, all over the city, training up residents to support us with the maintenance work has been a huge help, and residents are excited to do it as well.
Great. Has Parks and People been involved in any of your grants?
Not recently. We've worked heavily with Parks and People in the past. We definitely want to get back to the table with Parks and People. They actually have a really good youth program that's providing awareness about the environment, but then also supporting urban forestry work, which what I've been seeing is a great opportunity to connect those young individuals who are now transitioning out of high school or looking for employment to our workforce development program. So kind of continuing that training from youth-based training in the urban forestry field to then coming into our house for long-term career development.
Oh, great. The next question may involve all speakers since it's talking about different regions. Is there similar efforts for workforce development in DC and Richmond? Similar to what's going on in Baltimore?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about what's going on in Richmond. Certainly nothing as wonderful as the Baltimore Tree Trust yet. Hopefully someday we catch up a little bit. I know there are some really, really amazing programs being, well, one, Groundwork RBA is a workforce development, has a workforce development arm called Green Workforce. You can go and check out their website. Then there's very recently the Parks and Rec, the City Parks and Rec Department has started a workforce development project for teens in the city of Richmond for working on park development. And so that was actually one of the partners on one of the park spaces that we just developed over the summer. And so that was the two of the programs that I know, but I know that the RVA Green 2050 plan and the Richmond 300 plan make workforce development as part of like the climate resilience building aspect of the city's future very much important. So we'll be taking many of the best lessons learned from Bryant and other successful groups from around the country when we continue to adapt those. So Melissa, please.
Yeah, I think similarly, my answer is that we aren't in the same place that Baltimore is. Our primary NGO that we work with in the district to plant trees is called Casey Trees, and they certainly do a lot of work on workforce development, but I think we are looking at Baltimore as a model that we would like to replicate.
Brian, back to you on another question. We have lots of questions. How do you juggle the challenge of wanting shade trees, but also working within the overhead wire constraints? And just kind of the follow-up is, have you had success advocating for underground, I'm assuming wires, as a way to get bigger trees, particularly during bigger redevelopment?
The underground question, no. And with the juggle is the reality of it is we do not plant canopy-sized trees under any power lines, with the fear that the utility companies will come in later and do their beautiful cutting the tops of trees off. So unfortunately, we will stick with an understory when it comes to overhead power lines. Sometimes we can get a little creative depending on the space. We can make some adjustments as far as how close to that canopy tree can be planted to a line, but those opportunities are very few. So in the end, the sacrifice would be the smaller canopy tree, just to be on the safe side, and then following the protocols to eliminate any damage to that tree in the future because of the utility restrictions.
Okay, great. I'm going to combine the next two questions. They're related. Are most of the trees you plant native, and what tree species do you prefer to plant?
They are native. It's interesting because as you travel through Baltimore, you will see tons of red maples everywhere, mostly because they could take a beating. But we follow the Forestry Division's tree species list for Baltimore City. So they help us with making sure that we are not only being diverse in the species that we're planting, but we are following a system based off of the guidance of the Forestry Division.
Okay, let's see. Are you working with a climate resilient tree planting list?
That list again was taken into consideration by the Forestry Division for our species selections, and so we are using their system that they put in place for us.
Okay, and I think that's taken us. Let's see. All right. It says, can Bryant recommend the best native species for under those wires? So small trees under the wires. What are the top choices?
There you go. I could provide that list at another time. I don't have it in front of me yet. Maybe I can post it somewhere.
Okay. Yeah. We sure can get that out. Let's see. Has finding tree nurseries that provide trees in your target species been a challenge?
They have not, actually. We've been very lucky with the nurseries that we partner with. We have nurseries that we directly work with, but then our partner Tree Baltimore, they have a good list of nurseries that they connect with as well. So we've been very lucky with that.
And then I guess the last one we have, it can be opened up to anyone, but to what extent is tree health and longevity affected predominantly by soil clay? And this is in Baltimore. So I guess even any urban soils are going to affect that, but.
I mean, it's a challenge, you know, where there are in many areas that we plant, the soil conditions are very poor. And so we have to be mindful of two things, either a very intense soil amendment system, which can and cannot work in many cases, but being mindful about the species that can actually, that will have a greater chance of survival in those rough urban soil conditions.
Excellent. Well, perfect. That was the last question, and we're right on time with everything. So that's perfect. Thanks, Bryant, for your presentation. Then I'll turn it back over to Jeremy for the final Mentimeter.
Wonderful. All right, everybody, you know the drill at this point. I'm gonna put the, so many good questions. I'm gonna pose a few more to you to wrap things up, to go back over to the Mentimeter and share with us, you know, based on Bryant's and Melissa's spectacular presentations and my presentation, what is one new piece of information or idea that hit you particularly strongly based on this information? There are more concerns from community residents than I previously thought. I think that's something that once you get involved in community engagement and really make an effort to learn what people really think, it's a really eye-opening experience in a lot of ways. And I think if Melissa and Bryant, if you see something on this list as it appears that you'd like to just speak to, feel free. The lawn can be as hot as the sidewalk. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, that was a non-watered lawn. Just to be fair, it was a drought-stricken lawn. Yep, community involvement incredibly important to success. Yeah, the Science Museum was just awarded a new grant to try and do some community-based design and climate resilience education work, which is really exciting. This is great. Shade is cool. Yes, it is. Yep, this is great. Wonderful. Anybody, Bryant or Melissa, you see anything that you'd like to speak to based on you see this feedback coming in?
The feedback is great. I think I agree with everybody that doing the community engagement really well is such an important thing to success. I think that's something that we are learning. Every time we talk to people, we learn something totally new that we had no idea about, and it makes our policies better.
Yeah, the link between crime and weather has been established in this one and another one that I've seen come up a couple times. That's something that's really interesting and shines. Not only there's kind of two theories about it, and like eventually it gets too hot for anyone to really want to do anything, so you actually see crime drop after a certain temperature. But it seems like actually warmer winters, which is another symptom of climate change, allows for more crime of opportunity to occur throughout the winter, which is an interesting corollary. All right, well, so thank you for this feedback. I'll be posting on social media about your answers. So follow me on Twitter. So from this session, what kinds of things are you going to try? How are you going to take what you've learned and you found really impactful and turn it into an action? We'd love to hear about that. And they can be, you know, off the cuff sorts of things. We're not gonna, we don't have any sort of accountability measure. Advocate for more trees. Yes. Engage urban landowners. Great answers. Reach out to Bryant. Bryant, I think a bunch of people are going to be hitting your email address.
Sounds good.
Collab with local CIPs. Planting on private property. Talk to people. That's a big one. Maybe not a lot of talking to people going on these days. So I think you're gonna just talking to people is a great way. Hazard mitigation plan. I just saw that tree planting to that. That's a big conversation that's going on, especially with relation to this new BRIC or BRIC funding that's coming through. Environmental equality, yes. Environmental equity. Focus on jobs. That's a selling point for a lot of folks. Plant trees. Julie, our session convener, will be happy to see that response coming up as the main outcome. Talking to people, that's great. So I think keep on providing some feedback in their capital investment plan. Thank you, Jessica. Recordings will be made available. Please leave feedback in the session. There's a link in the chat to provide some feedback for us beyond what you've already given us. And I think we'll take any remaining questions. I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but that's pretty much all we had for everyone. So if you have any particular questions for me or Bryant or Melissa, we're willing to take them on, or if Craig or if the Alliance folks had anything left over they wanted to talk about.
Yeah, any other questions for our speakers? Well, excellent. I want to thank you all for attending the session. It was very engaging. And it was the final sessions for the Chesapeake Watershed Forum. So we do welcome your feedback on the forum. You could go, I guess, into your schedule and provide some feedback for this year's forum. So other than that, anyone have any other questions? Well, thank you very much, all.